back, everybody. We're in lesson 3 of our First Corinthians packet, and the topic of the week is humility.
Definitely going to be a challenging lesson, probably convicting in some spaces, but it'll be great to jump into.
Yeah. So we do have quite a big section to cover. We've asked our people to read 1 Corinthians 4, verse 6 through all the way through chapter 6, verse 8. So
that's a lot of ground.
A lot of ground to cover. And so we've only pulled out actually chapter 5 from within that bigger section. So as a way to maybe get your group started with observation, after, of course, you've done a good connecting time and maybe thought about what happened last week. As you open up to think about observation, one of the things we talked about was maybe what you could ask your group to do is section out these 2 or 3 chapters. Like, how would you break it down into a natural sections, and then ask, what is the big idea of each of those sections? Maybe you would already have the sections decided on and ask them what the big idea is, or even work it out on a board if you have that available.
I think especially when you got such a large section, to kind of get it into bite-sized pieces makes it so much easier to manage and less overwhelming and kind of easier for everyone to enter into. I love that. You'll kind of see here with the observational skill for the week, we talked about circling key words or phrases. And so, even for me, I was kind of doctoring my book and kind of working through it. And a couple of the themes are going to be obvious that kind of scream out are kind of the multiple uses of arrogant or boasting. And so you're going to see that throughout. Even on our lesson title, we talked about humility on the front cover. And then also you're going to kind of see the word judge used probably like 20 times. It is all throughout these opening chapters or these sections. And so kind of the idea of arrogance or humility and then the activity of judging. And what we're going to kind of see is it's going to seem like they're judging when they shouldn't be and they're not judging when they should be. And so how do we kind of parse through that and kind of sort through that as we kind of go through here?
Yeah, that's good. Another one of the skills was to underline verbs. While there weren't that many in this section right here, it's good to pay attention to what are the imperatives, what are the commands, Paul is kind of getting pointed with them now, and so what are some of those things that he is really asking them to do to correct the problems that he's been hearing about.
We don't just change themes, but we seem to change tones. You kind of talk about getting after it, but like, what did you see tone-wise, or how did you see a shift in this section?
Yeah, I really like this question 4 on the observation, asking about the tone, because it's really seen for me in the beginning of 4, 6 through 21. You see in 4, 6 through 13, Paul is really using irony and sarcasm. He's asking all these rhetorical questions of them, and then he's contrasting how they're viewing themselves with these rhetorical questions with how he actually views himself and his ministry and Apollos' ministry. Then he shifts at the end of chapter 4 into this real fatherly tone. He's like, guys, how many fathers do you have in the faith? I care about you. The reason that I'm coming down hard on you is because I love you. And so he's got fatherly concern and discipline. So I really thought that was an interesting,
So he starts to troll them at first and then kind of pivots. Yeah, it's interesting how you get this kind of somber and serious, but then also kind of caring and nurturing kind of as well throughout here.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, as we kind of jump into the interpretive section, the first question here, how does Paul describe his relationship with the church, and how does that set up the instructions in chapter 5? What we're trying to do is, in the opening question here, is, again, get everybody to kind of think back, kind of where have we been in the book? Where does that opening section in chapter 4 kind of relate to chapters 5 and 6? And so we're going to work week after week at kind of helping you not just remember where we've been, but then kind of keep tracing the flow forward. So really, if you remember, as we began, we talked a lot about the wisdom of God, the wisdom of the world. We looked particularly kind of at this, kind of the divisions that existed in the church. And now we've kind of pivoted over to now a section that's a little bit more focused on the disorder that's in the church. And particularly as we kind of go from those divisions to disorder, one of the things that's kind of holding these ideas together is going to continue to kind of be the sense of their own pride, their own sense of that they're wise in the world's eyes. And so what Paul is going to do is try to kind of unwind that. And interestingly enough, you're going to kind of see, again, this theme of arrogance and pride that's going to kind of shape through it. It's going to be the reason why Paul will say that they were judging him at the beginning of 4. They were arrogant. They were prideful. They were judging him when they should not have been. Then he's going to kind of pivot at the end of chapter 4 and kind of talk about that they see themselves more highly than they should see themselves, that they're judging themselves more loftily and more exaltingly than they ought to. And so Paul's going to correct their understanding of him. He's going to correct their understanding of themselves. And then he's going to show us how they were judging when they should not have been. And then in chapter 5, we're going to have this horrible, and this is the first kind of occasion that we get, this first situation, and it's horrible right off the bat, of incest.
Yeah.
And so we're going to have this situation. He's going to say, you should have judged here, but you didn't. And you didn't because you're arrogant. And because of your arrogance, they were almost proud as to the permissiveness that they were allowing within the church. Again, not allowing the church to be any different than the culture, thinking it was no big deal. It's going to say this is a big deal, and you should have judged here when you shouldn't have judged in those other places. And then in chapter 6, you're going to get to this discussion of lawsuits, which again is that they were arrogant, thinking that they could take this stuff out into the public court of opinion when they should have handled their stuff internally. They should have submitted themselves to one another instead of arrogantly claiming to their rights and going out in the public sphere and not being the church that should have been in the city. So this theme of arrogance is going to really kind of play all through chapters 4, 5, and 6 as we go from, in a sense, the divisions that existed to the disorder that exists.
Yeah, so good. And then that sets you up for question 2, which really dives into this really egregious sin that this church community is not only allowing, but even boasting in, which is hard to imagine, really. And so we've asked here, what is the impact of an individual sin on the community? And, I think you could spend some time thinking about that. And as we've said, apparently in this situation, that individual sin is actually feeding this other sin of arrogance and pride. It's when we were talking, we realized that actually it was not acceptable at all, what this person was doing. It was completely against...
Even in the culture.
Right. It was completely against Roman law. It was punishable by law. And so to have a community that's saying, in a sense, we're above the law. They were so arrogant, they were actually saying they were above the cultural law. And then that second part with the cross references, I really loved these. I think it might be worth taking the time to actually look a couple of these up and have them read out loud in your group, because actually what is the responsibility of a church community when there is egregious sin happening? It's the opposite of what the Corinthians were doing. And what you see in all of these cross references is the bonds of family and community compel the community to initiate and to go. So in Matthew, it says, go and point out their fault. In Galatians, it says, you who are mature, restore. 2 Thessalonians is warn. So it's a super active instead of being passive the way the Corinthians were being.
I love that some of those cross references, because they're going to highlight not just kind of methodology, like what are the steps to address things, but also I love that they're going to highlight the goal of this isn't punitive only.
Yeah.
Like the goal is in addressing sin or judging sin in the community, calling it out and calling the person out. The goal is to restore them and not just in a sense of kind of a punishment kind of mindset.
Yeah. So that then takes us to question 3. We've asked about judging. And so this goes to the actual interpretation skill of the week, which is to look up key words. Again, please know your group and ask, does anyone need a refresher on how to look up a key word? And take the time in your group if you need to have, or even ahead of time, have someone ready to say, here's how I look up a key word. That's a great way to get more people involved in the leadership of the group. But yeah, so the basic meaning and definition of the word judge is really interesting, I think, in this context. It really means to separate, to put asunder, to select, to choose. And it can also mean to approve, to esteem, or prefer. So in the sense that Paul's using this word throughout this section, it really, the meaning of the word depends on the context of that particular part of this section. So as Trey had said earlier, when the Corinthians were judging Paul and Apollos, they were judging their worthiness. They were taking the place of God and judging the fruit and the worth and the value of Christian ministers. And that was like, do not do that. And then in this section, when they should have been judging the sin, the egregious sin in amongst and putting asunder, deciding between, is this right or is this wrong? That's what judgment basically is in this case. They weren't doing it at all. So, yeah.
I like the second question at the end of question 3 too. Does it make a difference if the person is a believer or not? And I think it's going to be important, especially as we get to question 4, to say, yeah, it's a huge difference, because if they were judging unbelievers, and therefore maybe we're going to see later not associating, then we're going to have a church in a city that's isolating from those who don't know Jesus. And so this is particularly in mind for those that were believers as a part of the community that were engaged in ways that were contrary to the way of life that Christ had laid out to the church and that Paul's trying to instruct them along. So that's going to be a big deal, especially as we get to question 4. So question 4, this is, again, one of those places that we're going to say this is probably one of the more complex pieces of the passage. We want to make sure you're equipped for it as leaders, but want to remind you, don't let the night get bogged down here. It's easy to kind of run down into a rabbit trail and never get out. And so we're going to try to give you guys kind of some boundaries on that answer, some possibilities. But again, maybe set a time on your watch and you go, we're going to do this for 5 minutes and then we're going to move on to other pieces. So when Paul says that he's going to turn a person over to Satan, this person who's been committing incest, and he's going to say for the destruction of their flesh, the question is, what is happening here? Last time I checked, we don't necessarily do workshops on how do we hand someone over to Satan for the destruction of their flesh. So what is this? And do we still do it today? Are kind of 2 questions I want to wrestle with. The first is, I think particularly as you kind of see this, and we gave you a series of cross references, in the early church, as the gospel was going out and this church was being established, we often see God move in some ways that were frankly surprising and even a little bit unsettling. And so particularly what's happening here, and as I look at it, there's a range of possibilities in terms of what was the destruction of the flesh that Paul was handing this person over to. It could have been toward bodily affliction, that as they were living a sinful life, the bodily affliction and pain was meant to rouse them or awaken them that their lifestyle wasn't fitting. It also could be that bodily affliction might have led to, or what might be in mind is actually just premature death. That what Paul was handing this person over to Satan for was the actual deliverance of his body to death. That he would, in a sense, be brought home as a believer to the Lord earlier than was maybe originally intended. You see some of these kinds of examples of what we would think of as premature death in Acts chapter 5. Ananias and Sapphira dropped dead on the spot. There was seemingly to us not that big of a deal, but they had sold property to give to the church and then had lied about the price of the land and the gift that they gave to the church. And in the midst of that moment, the Lord drops them dead on the spot. 1 Corinthians 11, we have an explanation of the Lord's Supper, and we have some that took it in a sense cavalierly. And in that moment for the early church that was walking through communion, some fall asleep, which is a euphemism for premature death. They died in that moment. Even more complex passages like Hebrews 10 will talk a little bit about the same idea, that there could have been some incidents of premature death in the early church as the church was being established. Now, clearly not common, not a frequent thing, not something that I honestly think necessarily happens today. This may have been something in the apostolic age as the church was being established, which is why we don't do workshops. We don't do this in normal sense. What I do think you see, though, is you may have had bodily affliction that could have led to premature death. But you also, I think, have, as the rest of the passages is going to talk about, no longer associating with individuals that are leading an immoral life. So we go from this really special instance to more general sin within the body in general, and we kind of broaden out not to this extreme example, but to a more general operating principle of no longer associating with these believers that are sinning. And in that case, I think we still see that today. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we kind of go and looking at some of these other passages that we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
But one of the questions is not just what it was and does this still happen today, but it's why. Why was this happening? And so I know you're kind of thinking about that a little bit. Why do you think the Lord allowed this extremity of a situation in the early church?
Yeah. Well, I think I said this earlier. I really have been impressed that this is literally at the very baby steps of the movement of Jesus. This church has just been born 20 years ago at Pentecost. And so just like we would be very protective of a newborn, we would want, to at all costs protect its life, the preciousness of it. I think that's what God is doing here. He is taking extreme measures to protect this fledgling movement that could be so easily stamped out, both externally and here internally. And so he is going to stop at nothing to keep his church safe and moving forward.
Question 5 kind of then gets to kind of again to more of a normative situation. So, this incest sinning was so unique and it was clearly a grievous sin. It was clearly contrary to even the cultural baseline understanding of what was good and what was right and wrong. But in more normative situations, as there are those that are sinning within the body, how do we respond? And so our cross references in question 2 kind of give us a sense of, a person goes one-on-one, then 2-on-1. There could even be some situations where it would need to be spoken to the church in terms of what we would refer to as church discipline. Mm-hmm. But then the kind of the normative piece that's often there for many, even beyond that and after those steps, is that there may be some cases where believers remove the person from fellowship. Not maybe just the idea of communion, but actually the idea is even more here in the social table that exists. Even as a young family trying to find a night that we can all be around the table, this moment around the table is significant for community, just that's for our family. And so part of what you're kind of getting here, this idea is that the table where you were kind of had a community that was solidified together around a meal, that moment was no longer to be offered and invited for those believers that were really sinning and departing from the way. That removal from fellowship was intended to draw them back, not punitive, but was meant to be restorative over time, that they would eventually be brought back.
Yeah, so good. This is just another instance of being able to look up a word to associate. That might be another time to bring that skill back. And it just basically means to keep company with, to be intimate with, to fellowship around the table with. And in that culture, again, that was the place of social solidarity. That's where we knew we're people, we're together. This is my group. And so removal from that was, the punishment. So,
I throw out one other thought as it relates to kind of our skill for the week of word study. I think sometimes we can say word study in a Bible study setting, and it can feel like this crazy, elaborate academic exercise that feels really intimidating. And it's just funny, as a parent of teenagers, I spend a lot of time hearing what the kids say and needing to figure out what that means. And so I'm often looking words up or often having to ask, what does that mean? And so I would just encourage you guys as leaders to kind of bring word study not down or water it down, but we're just trying to figure out what's the range of meanings. We're utilizing some tools that help us understand what those words meant in the Greek, but it's just a dictionary for the Greek language. And so it's not that lofty or complex, but to kind of help people not feel intimidated of, we do this all the time.
Yeah.
What do these words mean? What are the words that we're using today?
Yeah, so good. Okay, and then our last question here kind of pushes us into chapter 6 about the legal disputes. And again, just trying to tie the theme together. Why is he admonishing them? To settle their legal disputes within the body and not go out. Again, the reputation of the church is just so critical at this moment and always. But I was just thinking about, this is just another failure of the church to be the church, the counter-cultural community that is living in this radically different way. They're failing again. They're living in the way that's expected instead of unexpected.
that kind of sets up, I think, question 2 in the application section, and just thinking about how does our conduct impact our reputation in the world. And so, ever since the survey lesson, we've been kind of thinking of these ideas of the church in the city, or the church in an immoral city. Like, how does the church kind of live and exist? And so, question 2, I think, kind of comes really easy off of that last interpretive question. And so, what were you thinking in terms of kind of reputation?
Yeah. I think for me, it actually spurred me to think of maybe a pre-question to question 2, and maybe to ask your group, do you see your primary identity as being a member of a countercultural community? Or do you just see yourself as sort of an individual Christ follower? I think in this culture, I mean, when you said Jesus is Lord, you are putting a target on your back that says you are now something other. And I think somehow in our world, we can kind of move in and out of church settings and really not see ourselves as inextricably linked to other church members. And so I think then, if I see myself as my primary identity being a group member, then what I do as an individual impacts the group and the reputation of the group. And so I don't know. That was just something I think we have to battle. Individualism. That's one of the isms and ideologies of our culture and our current moment, that they probably really didn't have back then. They had other problems. But we have to battle individualism. And so my conduct reflecting on you and us, I think might be a really interesting discussion.
As an only child, my mind didn't go to those places. My mind went a little bit more to question 1. And so it's funny how we drift to different places. But I liked question 1 in terms of application. And particularly, I think, thinking about, sin in the community. And I think even for my own life, I think there's a sense in which I'm often not reflective enough. I don't stop and slow and ask the Spirit to bring conviction. And I'm often running to the next thing or trying to celebrate the next thing, and actually kind of being willing and courageous enough to slow down and ask the Spirit to convict. And then I would challenge you as well to, just as she's thinking about individualism and the community, I'd say question 1 made me kind of think, actually along those lines as well, to think as we gather week in, week out to open the Word, that what we're trying to do is this isn't a classroom that we're just trying to pass content along, that if the goal is life change, then part of the community that we're establishing also should have a sense of transparency with each other. And so I think question 1, thinking about how we all have a tendency to have a low view of sin, to think sin isn't that big of a deal, that there needs to be some sense of accountability in our life, that there needs to be some people who can ask us the hard questions, ask us those uncomfortable questions, that there needs to be some people in our life that have access to those areas that are hidden and that we have a tendency to not show or not reveal. And so I think even as you think about your groups, as you think about upcoming meetings, trying to find at least one person, or maybe it's a culture of the group, that we're going to be transparent. We're going to talk about what we're struggling with, that we're going to be honest and open. And I think that also brings a sense of safety, because we don't all have it together.
Right.
We're not all crushing it, that we're all struggling in different ways. And so how do we bear each other's burdens? How do we challenge each other? And how do we kind of, in a sense, live a transparent life alongside of one another?
Yeah, so good. And that actually may be something that you would want to actually pray about in the meeting this week. I think using that prayer time to reinforce the themes and ideas that you discussed together, the application, if you will, that we came to as a group, and then pray about it. That's so powerful. That's amazing. We do have a new Engage tool here, but again, as we've mentioned, they're going to come up in 2 weeks. So if you've spent a lot of time talking about some of these other things and just don't have time for the Engage tool, you'll have a chance next week. But again, this idea of living as a countercultural community within a city with people all around us who need the light and life of Jesus Christ. This tool is just about easy ways to start a spiritual conversation with people that you've been praying for, people that are all around you.
We're excited for you guys to jump into this lesson. I hope just a few more weeks now in that able to go deeper with one another and kind of get to that place where we get real a little bit more.
Yeah, sounds good. All right, thanks.
Praying for you guys.